Tech Adventures, and today we are going to discuss evading network intrusion detection systems. So I'm wearing my Network Security Wizard shirt. My wife and I founded a company called Network Security Wizards in the late 90s. We produced the Dragon Intrusion Detection System, which was a Linux-based network IDS that had open signatures, and you could deploy it just about anywhere you wanted to. And we deployed it in the DoD, the intelligence community, bunch of banks. We had a really good time, and it really kind of set us up to do what we're doing today at Google Tech Adventures. It was our first company we founded and sold and so on. But it also gave us an sort of front row seat to all the different ways network intrusion detection system technologies can be used. So why talk about this in November of 2023? Well, basically, network IDS is coming back. Almost every next-gen SIEM, next-gen SOAR, next-gen SOC enablement system we see is doing some combination of monitoring endpoints, monitoring network activity, and monitoring cloud. And a lot of times when we monitor the cloud, people are sniffing in that cloud. And regardless, all of that network monitoring is a combination of flow, network intrusion detection, application logging, and so on. So everything I'm about to say applies to all of this new technology that's out there. And it's important for people to understand that, we've been in this industry a long time. Things are cyclical. I think network monitoring is coming back. Networks are getting bigger, and attackers are still getting smarter. All right, so the first thing you want to talk about with a network IDS is where can you deploy it? So if you have a network and you have an egress point like a firewall or a router, that's a great place to install a network IDS. Now that will give you traffic going in and out of your network. It won't tell you about lateral movements on the inside of your network. In order to do that, you need to either go to an internal switch, span that switch such that a copy of all of the traffic flowing through that switch goes out to one port, and it can be monitored by a network IDS. And in many cases, the network IDS is deployed as agents on the endpoints of the machines you want to monitor. Now, modern EDRs do network monitoring. They don't necessarily do network IDS where they're trying to classify attacks and things like that. But for the most part, this is typically how you're going to deploy a network IDS. Now, the network IDS might be part of your content inspection at your gateways, like your firewalls and your proxies and so on. It might also be part of your zero trust network as you connect to the cloud, go into your SaaS apps, and so on. Now, of course, if you know about a network IDS and it's not covering a certain network, you can do an attack there and evade it that way. But evading network IDS is actually something that's a little bit more of a science. So the first thing, most network IDSs are programmed to look for known attacks. So let's assume you have a 0-day where you are going to do some sort of attack and the network IDS is not programmed to look for these attacks. Typically, it's going to look for exploits against certain toolkits or certain sort of artifacts in the network traffic of looking for exploitation of a vulnerability. So for example, older protocols, one of my favorite ones was the IMAP protocol. This used to be how people would download email to their endpoints. There was a username parameter in that, and they had basically limits of like maybe 16 or 32 characters for that. So an intrusion detection rule that said we want to look for anybody logging on to this IMAP thing where the username was more than 300 characters or even like 30 characters, that could be indicative of a buffer overflow or some sort of denial of service attack. So that's the kind of signature that's more of a generic signature versus something like a certain CVE exploit that has a known pattern of how it's going to look like in the traffic. So regardless, you program network IDSs to look for these things. If you know about an attack that they don't know about, you might be able to do an attack that they don't see. Having said that, they might compensate and look for responses from the targets that they are monitoring that could be indicative of an attack. So for example, if you're using a network IDS to monitor a web application, maybe you don't know about every possible attack that can succeed against that web application, but you certainly don't want to see it serve a shell to an attacker, or perhaps render a password file, a configuration file, or even just sending documents out, right? Those could all be the results of a network attack. And if you observe that, that might be something that's worth investigating. Now, network IDSs will do things like have some anomaly detection where maybe it doesn't observe any of those things I just talked about, but it sees there's an increase in traffic or a dramatic increase in activity at a host, that sort of thing. We're not going to get into the network-based anomaly detection stuff, but most network IDSs do have something like that looks for them. Now, another category of evading network IDS detection is to encode your attack. Let's say you're going to do an attack, which is a known attack, everybody knows about it, but you still want to do it, and you have a target that is vulnerable to it, and you don't want the network IDS to detect it. So one of the things you could do is you can encode your attack. Now, encoding can happen at many, many different layers. In the 90s, there was a paper from SNI that came out that basically said they had found a bunch of ways to do normal attacks that everybody knew about, but do them in a manner that the network IDS couldn't detect it. A good example is packet fragmentation. Now, as your packets traverse the internet, they might be moved through networks that can't fit the packet through the network that's there. This can cause something called packet fragmentation, where your packet is split into smaller packets, and then when it gets to the target host reassembles it. Well, it turns out that if I can fragment my packets, I might be able to insert some extra packets, and if I know that the target host is going to reassemble them one way, and my network IDS might reassemble them another way, I might be able to sneak a valid attack because it's looking for a certain pattern, but when it gets reassembled at that target host, that's tough. Now, you can counteract this by just not allowing fragmented packets into your network, or making sure all your networks go through the internet, with a proxy, that sort of things. But there's a never-ending list of ways to do encoding. Another good example is with web attacks, where if you're looking for a certain URL and you know that this URL is being used to attack Atlassian or attack anybody who happens to have a vulnerability this week, you might be able to encode the URL and change some of the characters to their Unicode encoding. And you could do this n number of times. So you might be able to take a slash, convert that to its ASCII code, and then take the percent in that ASCII code and encode that. So it really depends how much time your network IDS is going to look at these sorts of attacks. You might be able to overwhelm that network IDS and so on. Now, today in 2023, there's a lot of attacks that are encrypted. We've seen a lot of attacks where they leverage HTTPS, and you really can't evaluate that until you're at the endpoint or you have somebody who's doing break and inspect. Now, a lot of corporations do break and inspect. If you're doing break and inspect, HTTPS, that type of encryption has no bearing. Network intrusion detection works just fine, and you get full visibility, and be surprised how many things actually happen in that you're not seeing if you're not doing that break and inspect. Having said that, though, if you're not doing break and inspect, you have to kind of rely on anomaly detection or threat filtering and that sort of thing. Now, another type of way to evade an IDS is to change the C2 that you're looking for. Now, we've done this in the routers attack video, where we talk about how Chinese APT is getting into perimeter routers, and the network command and control that the internal computers are using to communicate is actually something different than what you're looking for. So maybe you've been found out that a certain IP address is a bad guy IP address. So you've programmed all your sensors and network IDSs and hunt teams to go look for that. But the adversary is smart, and they know that on the inside of the network, we're not going to use that IP. We're going to wait till we get to the router and do translation there. So then on the way out, it will actually be going to the C2 that's intended. Some internal intrusion detection systems and firewalls actually have a limit for how many C2 systems they can use. And this is another form of bypass, right? Like my Fortinet firewall, I'm a big fan of Fortinet firewalls. I've got a limit of like 10,000, 100,000 IPs, something like that. The threat list that we get from certain threat feeds it's in the millions. It's in the millions. That's another way to bypass it. So this is just a quick high level of all the different ways you can evade network intrusion detection systems. There's certainly more, but I believe, as I said when I started off this video, that this hybrid approach of looking at our network traffic, doing application monitoring, doing DNS monitoring, doing endpoint monitoring, and trying to bring that all together into one spot is definitely the way we're rolling right now. And it's certainly something you get with a lot of zero trust networks. But at the same time, these old ways of evading things are probably still very much intact, which is why at Gula Tech we tend to invest in some cutting edge technologies. So the two companies that are in this space are Threader and Trinity Cyber. So Threader is it's a device. It can be a virtual device that can basically enforce or detect hundreds of millions of bad guys, C2s, and DNS names all at once. Trinity Cyber is basically a cloud-based network intrusion detection system from the future. They're basically doing real-time content disarming on everything from client-side attacks, even if they're zipped and compressed and so on, and really advanced attack detection for a wide variety of internet-facing protocols, as well as, like I said, client-side applications. So feel free to check both of these out. And if you want to learn more, visit our website at gula.tech, subscribe to this YouTube video, or chat me up on LinkedIn. I'm Ron Gula. Thanks for learning about evading intrusion detection systems. Have a great day.